Okay, well, welcome everyone. Good evening. My name is Michael White. I'm a librarian at the Glenview Public Library, and on behalf of our partner at the Arlington Heights Memorial Library, we'd like to welcome you to tonight's program, 33 and a third, Annie Zaleski on Duran Duran's Rio. So thank you for being here. Tonight is the 9th in a series of 33 and a third programs, a series that we started back in June of last year, and will continue through May. 12 months, 12 albums, a different album each month, a new author talking about their 33 and a third book and its classic essential album. If you didn't know before this evening, 33 and a third is a series of short books about popular music, each book focusing on an iconic individual album that occupies a specific place in music history, and tonight's album certainly does that. Hosting these programs and meeting these authors each month and talking about music has been a real joy for us, and I hope you'll consider joining us for future programs. We've got a few more lined up through May. We'll continue to take advantage of the virtual space that's been created by the pandemic to bring you a new author from around the country to discuss their writing, their love of music, through a wide range of essential albums, from last month's Elvis Presley to this month's Duran Duran. Up next on Thursday, March 3rd, Joe Gross on Fugazi's In on the Killtaker. Just a couple quick bits of housekeeping before we welcome Annie and get started. My colleague Neil and I will be monitoring questions in the chat throughout, so please ask any questions that you may have using the chat feature. We love that engagement. We love to hear what you're thinking, any questions you have for Annie. When you open the chat box, you'll notice that you can send a chat to everyone. There's like a little caret there. You can send a chat to everyone. Specific people are only hosts and panelists. We'd love it if you just send the chat to everyone so your fellow audience members can see your questions and your comments. Closed captioning is enabled through Zoom. If you want to turn that on, you'll find the button at the bottom of the Zoom menu down there, the lower portion of your screen. Click on the little CC closed captioning symbol. If you have any trouble, feel free to send us a note in chat and we'll see what we can do to help. Also, I do want to let you know we're going to launch a brief poll. It's maybe 10 or 15 minutes into the program, just to find out if there's more than one person viewing on your screen, wherever you're at. We just want to get an accurate count on attendance, so thanks for that. With that, it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's author. Annie Zaleski is a Cleveland-based author and journalist, an award-winning writer with profiles, interviews, and criticism in a variety of publications. Her bylines include Rolling Stone, NPR Music, The Guardian, Salon, Time, Billboard, the AV Club, Vulture, the LA Times, Stereo Gum, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and Las Vegas Weekly. She also contributed liner notes to the 2016 reissue of RAM's Out of Time and Game Theory's 2020 collection, Across the Barrier of Sound, Postscript. So Annie, we're really excited to have you here tonight. Thank you for being here.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. So thank you everyone for being here. I really appreciate it. We're here to talk about Duran Duran's Rio. The LP is nearly 40 years old. It's turning 40 on May 10th. And last May, I published my 33 and a third book on Rio, which is right here. When writing this book, I spoke with more than 50 people, did original interviews, including band members, record label employees, graphic designers, photographers, musicians, and journalists. And unless noted, the interviews in the book are all original. So very briefly, I've been pitching Rio to 33 and a third since 2007. And on my third try, I finally put together a proposal that finally convinced them that they should publish this book. And so, why did I stick with this pitch? Because Rio has a great story. And so I put together a PowerPoint and some kind of brief excerpts from my book to talk about that. All right, so why did I stick with my pitch for Duran Duran's Rio? So basically, it's one of the best albums of the 80s. I think that's a pretty solid argument. But not only does it have memorable singles, it has Hungry Like the Wolf, Rio, Save a Prayer, but it's also a well-sequenced album that's cohesive. Every song fits together and has a place on the album. As this picture sort of implies, there are many moods. So Rio was released on May 10th, and side one is kind of the more upbeat party side of the record, you know, Save for Lonely in Your Nightmare, which is kind of melancholy. This is kind of the groove heavy, danceable side that you throw on to get pumped for a party. Side two, however, is kind of a moody, artsy, more introspective side. That's the side you put on to brood in your bedroom over an unrequited crush, or maybe you had a real bummer of a night out. So that's what you put on side two. Rio, of course, though, has a very, very classic, memorable cover. You might say it embodies the 80s. So there's the painting of the smiling Rio girl, as keyboardist Nick Rhodes tends to call it. And that was done by Patrick Nagel, an artist who was very popular in the early 80s, but sadly passed away in 1984, well before his time. So he was known for illustrations in Playboy and other magazines, and he was hired to create a painting specifically for Rio. He gave the band two options, and the one you see on the cover was chosen. But, you know, the cover is, and the painting, of course, is amazing. You can see kind of on the right-hand side, it was later used for a Nagel show in Texas. But there was a graphic designer named Malcolm Garrett who had worked with Duran Duran since their first singles and was known for work with punk bands like the Buzzcocks. He then kind of took the painting and elevated it. When I spoke to him for a book, he said, Rio made me think of cigars and cigar packaging, the whole idea of something Latin and something Cuban and South American. So he picked a font that conveyed that vibe. You can kind of see on the album cover. And then also had a little cigar band detail that seals the record kind of on the lower right corner, as if you had to slice open a box to get to the cigars, the goods, or the music inside. Rio's success also owes a lot to cinematic music videos, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Back in 1982 and 1983, few bands were as ambitious as Duran Duran in music videos, and few bands were as talented enough to pull off grand visions. But curiously enough, Rio wasn't a success everywhere at first, not even remotely. In fact, in the US, it took months for the LP to become a hit. Duran Duran actually had quite an uphill battle to reach American success. Above all, Duran Duran had to work hard to convince everybody that their music deserved to be heard, and they were tenacious, a quality that lingers today. A couple of weeks ago, the band was nominated for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for the very first time, and drummer Roger Taylor spoke to Billboard and said, "We're continuing to survive in a musically creative manner and in a very tough industry. I think people love survivors." Rio was one of the first big examples of the band sticking it out and becoming survivors. So there were many factors that came together to make Rio a success, and we'll touch on a few. So let's first talk a little bit about how Duran Duran got to Rio. So incredibly enough, the album arrived less than 2 years after Duran Duran settled on a permanent lineup. Vocalist Simon Le Bon, guitarist Andy Taylor, bassist John Taylor, drummer Roger Taylor, no relation, as every article in the 80s says, and keyboardist Nick Rhodes. This lineup of the band played their first show on July 16th, 1980 at the Rum Runner, a club that served as kind of their home base and headquarters in their hometown of Birmingham, England. So the members of Duran Duran boasted diverse influences and brought many different band loves to the table in disco, glam, hard rock, synth pop, punk, post-punk. And they combined all of those things in really intriguing and surprising ways. When I talked to Andy Taylor, he said Nick Rhodes would do Eno, as in Brian, and I would do Jeff Beck or Jimmy Page. I'd do the guitar bit and he'd do the weird bit. And then somewhere in the middle, we found a way to get the musicality right. You could say, John, that Duran Duran is a study in contrast. In fact, bassist John Taylor was very fond of saying that Duran Duran wanted to be a cross between the Sex Pistols and Chic. Now, on the surface, that seems fairly preposterous, trying to combine bands who seem to have nothing in common on the surface. Chic were chart-topping disco dance band. The Sex Pistols were a rabble-rousing punk band. But Duran Duran somehow did it, and they basically combined unstoppable dance grooves and a defiant take on rock music that was trying to carve a futuristic, fresh path forward. So that took a bit to get there. Duran Duran's debut album, a self-titled 1981 LP, was heavily indebted to Roxy Music in Japan. So the band were still trying to find their sound and footing. But when the band came to the US in fall of 1981, they were well received on a live tour. And they also received attention in America because of the video for Girls on Film, which was infamous in its unedited form for nudity, some rather risque scenes involving mud wrestling and whipped cream. As you'll see here from Billboard, a little article from October of 1981, it was proclaimed the most controversial rock promo video of 1981. While an Associated Press feature on the band theorized a Girls on Film clip may be the first X-rated rock video, a pornographic fantasy film. By the end of 1981, though, Duran Duran was moving forward and Rio's songs were starting to emerge. They released My Own Way as a single in November, although this version was much different from the one that actually ended up appearing on Rio. This one was very brisk and had disco reminiscent strings. The band members ended up not being very thrilled with the results and the direction, so they redid it for Rio. Last Chance on the Stairway was in their live set in a very familiar form. They had some elements of the title song Rio floating around from an older song that had gone through many incarnations. John Taylor told me he described the song kind of like a painting with many layers. As he quote, "They put the painting under x-rays and they find all these different versions of the painting. Rio was kind of like that." Hungry Like the Wolf came out of a demo session that emerged after a night of indulging in London nightlife, as the band put it. I believe Nick Rhodes is fond of saying he happened to be hungover, but they went to the studio anyway. But each member of Duran Duran turned up at that demo session and brought their ideas to the table and came up with Hungry Like the Wolf and turned the song into something great. So even before Duran Duran entered the studio, they did demos with a man named Bob Lamb in Birmingham, who was a musician himself and also worked with UB40. Duran Duran had demoed with him in the late 70s, even before Simon Le Bon had joined the band. I tracked down Bob Lamb, who's actually living in Thailand right now, and he graciously gave me a few quotes about Duran Duran, on the cusp of Rio. And he basically told me that the changes in the band after their touring experiences were fairly obvious. Many young bands have the drive to try to make it in the challenging world of the music business, but only a few ever get there. In the case of Duran Duran, they knew without a doubt from the beginning that they would be successful, and they wore it well. So in early 1982, Duran Duran decamped to Air Studios in London, founded by the late Beatles producer, George Martin. Memorably, Paul McCartney happened to be there working as well in one of the other studios. And every single member of Duran Duran remembers the Beatle coming in to say goodnight and generally being supportive of the young band. As Nick Rhodes told me, it was very, very strange for some young kids from Birmingham who aspired to be, a tiny little bit of whatever the Beatles were. But he was so charming and encouraging, he could not have been nicer to us. Duran Duran were very focused in the studio and knew what they were doing. They were working with Colin Thurston, who had also produced and engineered their debut. They had strong demos, and they were all focused on making a great album. Also in the win column, though, for them is they were open to experimentation. So the title track of Rio is one of the most indelible singles of the 80s, most notably because of a sax solo, courtesy of Andy Hamilton. I tracked down Andy, and he was gracious enough to give me an interview, and he gave some really fascinating insights about recording this solo. So he said he hadn't heard the song before arriving at Air Studios for the sessions. And like other sessions he had done, he said he just kind of improvised his parts, drawing on feel and intuition. As he said, luckily with Rio, there were only really 2 chords for most of the solo. It was only at the end where it changed. It wasn't that I had to negotiate overloads of chords. With Rio, I just played the first thing that came to my head and hoped that it worked. So he didn't need to worry though, because Nick Rhodes oversaw the session to ensure the part was perfect. As he told me, he considered the sax solo as a very important part of the dynamic of the song. I knew it could not be just another sax break. It needed to be special and unique as well as completely memorable. The intro to Rio, meanwhile, reflected Rhodes' recent fascination with the experimental composers John Cage and Karlheinz Stockhausen. The keyboardist picked up metal rods and dropped them on the strings of Air Studios' grand piano, which had been mic'd up for the occasion, which of course made a huge racket. Or as he put it, a fantastic noise. They didn't really settle down until a good 30 seconds. But after recording that, he did one other thing. He wanted to reverse kind of the shambling, chaotic sound by turning the tape over. So if you listen to Rio now and you hear the beginning, that kind of sounds like something, coming up from the mix, starting the record. That's exactly what that experimentation is. So in addition to experiments like that, the band came up with a song called The Chauffeur in the studio. Simon Le Bon had written lyrics several years before that, but it turned into an all electronic song. Nick Rhodes admits that an all electronic track was politically a little difficult with the band at the time, but during periods when he wasn't needed in the studio, he retreated to a production room, along with Rio's tape op, Renate, and they spent hours sculpting the song, programming a sequencer, adding layers of synths, and creating beats on the Roland TR-808. When it came time to mix Rio, it was mixed on an analog desk, meaning it was a hands-on experience that involved fine-tuning the sound with manual tweaks. To get the mix set, it was a performance, literally a live performance of the mix with different people involved, Rhodes told me. And the mixing process was intense. He had a hotel room in London, but barely used it. But the hard work was worth it. So when Rio was released in May 10th, in England, it was an immediate commercial smash. It debuted on the charts at number 4, peaked at number 2 a week later, and was kept from the top spot only by a greatest hits compilation from the band Madness. Rio's first single, Hungry Like the Wolf, a little bit more of a modest start. He entered at number 35 on the charts, but it was good enough that Duran Duran was appeared on top of the pops the week Rio came out, 3 days after the album's release. As we'll see here, though, in the United States, Rio wasn't quite as successful. This is from the Billboard album charts from June 5th, 1982. You can see the record debuted at number 164 after the week before it was at number 204. As you can see, Donny Iris, Missing Persons, Jim Carroll Band, Triumph, these are all Kim Wilde, these are all very familiar names. But, Rio was just kind of Duran Duran were just kind of another band at that time trying to become popular. So over the next few weeks, the LP moved up the charts a little bit, but it ended up stalling out at number 122 in July and then sliding back down. So, success was a long time coming, but it took a combination of factors for Duran Duran to finally kind of reach that brass ring and grow into the superstars they are today. So you can't tell the story of Rio without music videos. So following in the footsteps of other UK artists such as Kate Bush, David Bowie, and Queen, David Bowie were known for pairing striking visuals with their music. Luckily enough, around Rio, the band's label really believed in the band. They were on EMI in the UK. Their American label situation was a little bit more complicated. They were on Harvest Records, but then they were also, there was marketing support provided by Capitol Records. So it's a very complicated thing. So it's you can, even different releases have different labels. And so that was also challenging for Duran Duran in the US. But in the UK, EMI threw their support behind them. And EMI also had plans to produce a full-length Duran Duran video album, which was a cutting-edge medium that was fairly new at the time. Bands like Blondie had released one very notably, and bands like Iron Maiden and the Tubes would also be doing that, but it was still kind of a very new concept. So right as Rio was being done, the band flew to Sri Lanka on the way to Australia for a tour, and they filmed videos for Hungry Like the Wolf, Save a Prayer, and then Lonely in Your Nightmare, which is not seen very often. They worked with director Russell Mulcahy, who was Australian, but he was known for work with Elton John and Ultravox. So Hungry Like the Wolf was an adventure video. It was very much like Indiana Jones. As you see this picture here, it starred Simon Le Bon, the band's lead singer, who had acting experience as a child and was actually a drama student before joining Duran Duran. So he was very comfortable in front of the camera and really kind of knew how to work it and was very comfortable putting on other personas, which was unique at the time. A lot of musicians were very uncomfortable with that. As Russell told me, Simon is very much an adventurer and a bit of a movie star, he said with a laugh. Although with other band members, Russell knew that there's a comfort zone, as he put it, and you don't want them to be out of their comfort zone. So let's watch a little bit of Hungry Like the Wolf right now, just to kind of see this scene that they had there. All right. So as you will see, that video was pretty much so different than anything else on MTV at the time. I mean, it would come after black and white Who videos and, performance videos from bands. So it looked completely different. So let me go back to the PowerPoint here. So, so that they had these videos in Sri Lanka. So right after Rio came out, the band went on vacation to Antigua, and they were hanging out, having a good time, hanging out on the beach, and their managers called them and said, "Hey, stay there. We're going to film some music videos." And so while they were there at this beautiful location, they ended up shooting videos for Rio and Nightboat, also with Russell Mulcahy. So Rio, I think, is known for the scene you probably see here of Simon Le Bon, at the top, the helm of a yacht, the wind is going through his hair. The band are in these beautiful suits, and it basically looks like, like just glamour and fanciness. The most interesting thing about that is that Rio wasn't necessarily super popular at the time. So the band were almost telegraphing kind of an aspirational lifestyle. But the video, Rio is actually funnier than it gives it credit for. It's very kind of cheeky. It's a little bit kind of Monty Python-esque at times with, people, stepping on a banana peel, being yanked into the water by a phone cord and collapsing in the ocean after being pinched by a crab. So it's actually very silly. As Russell told me, the video is totally over the top, but it's meant to be totally fun. The song is fun. The video is meant to be total fun. It's a little tongue in cheek. There's a little homage. It's not too deep, just colorful fun and a celebration, basically. So let's watch a little bit of Rio too. All right, so that's a little bit of Rio, the video. And as you see, there was the mix of kind of humor, the boys, besides, being looking good and trying to act like playboys, or basically all the women in the video basically kind of roll their eyes at them or like, yeah, okay. So that's Rio. And I guess in Antigua, they also filmed a video for Nightboat, which is a song from their first album. And they kind of made a zombie movie. So they were a little bit ahead of the time in terms of the 80s movies and, Michael Jackson, monster videos and things like that. So so they had these, and then Duran Duran also had a video for The Chauffeur. And that was actually filmed in London. The band was not in the video. It was filmed by Ian Eames, who was a decorated director. He was known for animation work with Pink Floyd and was a friend of Marshall Mulcahy's. And I talked to him, and he was so interesting, telling kind of how the video came together and how he kind of viewed it as sort of like a Helmut Newton video. And it was very, very glamorous. And he really kind of, Duran Duran, now when you see them, it's very kind of like that. It's very elevated. And Ian really picked up on something in the band very early on that I think a lot of people didn't. So that's The Chauffeur then. So we had all these music videos. Duran Duran made all these music videos, and where were they airing? So in the UK, music videos were big. They were on top of the pops. It was really kind of the fabric of music in the UK. In the US, there were some music video shows. Dance clubs might play that and just kind of starting. But luckily in 1981, August 1st, 1981, to be specific, 6 weeks after Duran Duran released their first record, MTV launched in America, used the original 5 VJs. So Duran Duran and MTV were really made for each other. The band were very smart. They heard about MTV and they talked to the channel, even when the channel was still kind of getting going, and really, said, hey, they saw the potential, and MTV saw the potential. As Ellen Hunter, one of the original MTV VJs, told me about why Duran Duran stood out, everybody at that point was used to touring and playing live, not being seen on television. So they didn't have to exercise that part of them. Young Brits, as they came over, were into that sense of display and knew how to work the camera. As he put it, American bands or acts with quote unquote more of an American sensibility toward videos, like Rod Stewart, tended to take a little more literal approach to their clips, he said. So someone would be standing in the rain, smoking a cigarette, thinking about, my honey at a lamppost. If those were the song lyrics, you saw it on screen. Nothing more conceptual than that. But Hunter saw more visual ambition in bands such as Duran Duran. The music of the young new wave romantics lent itself better to a more ephemeral interpretation, or a little looser interpretation. So for the week of July 3rd, 1982, MTV added Hungry Like the Wolf in the video rotation, which is, basically less than 2 months after the record came out, when it was still trying to gain a foothold anywhere in the US. So MTV was on this early. And, Hungry Like the Wolf started getting MTV airplay. And so that really kind of started, Duran Duran started getting a foothold in cities where MTV was wired for MTV. In September, MTV also added Rio into rotation. And so while, actual video of MTV from this time is actually really hard to find, because VCRs weren't necessarily very common until 1983 and 1984, there is some video from late 82, 1983, where people taped hours of MTV, and Duran Duran does show up. And you can just tell that the videos are just head and shoulders above everything else going on at that time. So despite all of this MTV support, though, in America, widespread radio support for Duran Duran's music wasn't coming. And at the time, radio hits were still the way to break bands in the United States. It was still very, very old-fashioned in that way. So Duran Duran had received college radio support, and then some commercial alternative rock stations were supporting Rio after it came out, such as K-Rock in Los Angeles, KNAC in Long Beach, California, WHFS in Washington, D.C., and WILR on Long Island. And the label had had ideas that there were, that Duran Duran could break at radio. As Nick Rhodes told me, our label sensed that there was a chance to break us through at radio, but the sound we had was a little too edgy and English for American radio. Things tended to be a bit more slick and smooth and compressed. When I talked to John Taylor, he summarized the challenge even more succinctly. They were having trouble getting Hungry Like the Wolf, getting the Duran Duran sound on the same radio stations that played Van Halen and Journey. Now, I was pretty tickled when I pulled up the rock charts from August of 1982 and discovered that Hungry Like the Wolf did chart a little bit, but right in front of Journey and Van Halen. So John Taylor, that was, he was dead on the money. This was the first time it debuted on the rock charts. But if you look at the charts that week, it was very interesting. There were a few modern songs: Flock of Seagulls, I Ran, The Go-Go's Vacation, as you see, Lords of the New Church, Open Your Eyes, Roxy Music's Avalon. But Duran Duran was so different than everything else that was going on in the rock world at that point. It was just all meat and potatoes rock and roll, as you see, Kansas, Asia, Billy Squier, John Cougar. But the band's label, so Duran Duran's label in America, Capitol, decided that different remixes were needed to jumpstart the band's fortunes. So the person given that job was a man named David Kirschenbaum. He was a respected record producer who had signed the English songwriter, pianist Joe Jackson to A&M Records. So he basically wasn't looking to do a completely different redo of the song, but mainly kind of took what was there and made some tweaks. As he told me, It was just a matter of rebalancing the song, getting the rhythms to be a little bit different and ending up with different sounds and EQs and so forth. I just felt like it was such a commercial song that if it had the right impact and the right dynamics, it could break through. That's really what I was trying to do, is get dynamics and make it really pop. So David Kirschenbaum and band members, including Nick Rhodes and Simon Le Bon, hunkered down at a studio in Los Angeles to kind of work on that. So the resulting remix was noticeably different. For example, the beginning drums are slightly altered, and you can hear that Simon's vocals are more up front, but it really maintained the core of the song. So I'm going to play a little bit of that just to show you the difference, especially in the modern world. It is, where'd you go? It's so funny how it's not as different as you would think it is. It's so, the fact that it was such a big deal back then, it was just so strange because, you know, it's not a huge difference now. All right, so that's just a little bit there. And I mean, you can kind of hear that the drums are a little bit more pronounced and the vocals are a little bit more pronounced. You don't hear the keyboards very much. So it was definitely sort of calibrated so not to scare people basically into, scary keyboards and new wave. But everyone liked the remix. And so David Kirschenbaum ended up remixing the entire first side of Rio. The songs were kind of basically the lengths, he basically made them into more dance friendly remixes. And so the Rio was reissued in America. So there was a second pressing. But even though they did that, Duran Duran still needed another boost before Hungry Like the Wolf took off, even though that sounds really great. So enter the Carnival EP. So this was a 4-song, 12-inch EP. It arrived in stores on September 3rd, 1982. And so this is a couple months after, not too long after the Hungry Like the Wolf remix was sort of out there in the world. So this was touted in ads as a celebration and stylish sound, and it had a mix of older and newer songs. You can kind of tell from the photos of the band on the cover that it's a little bit different, maybe a little bit more grown up. And so they were definitely kind of trying to change the image a little bit. So these mini LPs were very common, released in the early 80s. US record labels used them to promote newer bands because they were cheaper. So, if you're a consumer and you're not sure if you want to try out a new band, you could spend $5 and get an EP, and it's kind of a low cost way to try something out. And they were also, because they were more affordable as well, the US was in the midst of a recession back in 1982. And so that was also, and the record industry wasn't doing so hot in the early 80s. So that was also a way to kind of get people to buy things again. But perhaps more important, mini LPs lent themselves to dance floor friendly bands like Duran Duran. And Duran Duran had been known for their 12-inch remixes. On their first album, they had what they called night versions, which were extended remixes of their singles that they actually wrote and arranged extended arrangements themselves and played it in the studio. And so they were really big fans. And going back to being Chic fans, they were super big fans of doing that. And so basically, being a dance friendly band, this was right up their alley. And as John Taylor put it to me, everybody was making dance music by this point. I mean, really all the cool records from 81, 82 If you couldn't dance to them, well, they weren't cool records. It was a dance floor moment. So on the Carnival EP, you have the night version. That's what the Duran Duran called their extended remixes of Hungry Like the Wolf, and then curiously enough, Girls on Film, which was from their first record. And then on side B were David Kirschenbaum remixes of My Own Way and Hold Back the Rain. Carnival was released in different versions around the world as well. And so each release had different track listing too. So if you're a collector, you had many Carnivals to try to buy. So dance clubs, though, also were where all the cool new singles started. If a song was successful there, that also laid the groundwork for success at other places. For example, radio DJs were also in clubs. And as it so happens, they might take popular songs back to their day job. So a funny thing happened. The longer night version of Hungry Like the Wolf started getting airplay on radio. The Carnival EP actually charted, and in the fall of '82 was extremely popular. It was way more popular than Rio on the charts, believe it or not. But so the label kind of saw what was going on. And so Rio was reissued again with the night version of Hungry Like the Wolf, the one that was here, substituted in for the David Kirschenbaum mix. And it was basically the same thing. So it was all David Kirschenbaum on side one, except Hungry Like the Wolf was a remix helped by Colin Thurston. So, because basically keeping track of all the different album and single remixes from the Rio era is ridiculous. Like good luck doing that. It's like it's the little meme of the guy looking at the whiteboard, kind of holding his head, and there's like equations everywhere. That's exactly what that is. So finally, though, all of this stuff came together: videos, dance clubs, remixes, reissues. And in late 1982, Hungry Like the Wolf finally started taking off at rock radio. Around Thanksgiving, stations started to add it, and things really took off in December. And so then finally we reached 1983. So Duran Duran became a success. Here were just kind of two of the examples of the ads that were released at the time when they basically started breaking through. So as you see, the year of Duran Duran, it's inevitable. So the one on the left was from an early January 1983 in a trade magazine. And, when you hear someone say that, the year of Duran Duran, that seems very, hyperbolic, but it actually came true. It was almost understated. So Hungry Like the Wolf hit #1 in Canada in 1983. Duran Duran played for one of their biggest fans, Princess Diana, at a UK charity concert. They appeared on Saturday Night Live in March. They preceded their Saturday Night Live appearance with an appearance at a Video Shack location in Times Square that drew 5,000 people. It was mayhem. There were so many fans there. And in the Billboard issue for the week ending January 22nd, 1983, Hungry Like the Wolf hit #1 on the rock radio charts. And it stayed there for the next 3 weeks. So Hungry Like the Wolf, though, soon expanded beyond the rock world, and they started receiving significant airplay on top 40 stations. So actually 39 years ago this week, the week ending February 19th, 1983, the single reached the top 10 of the Billboard Hot 100, the band's first top 10 single. It would later peak at #3 in late March, and it was kept from #1 only by Culture Club's Do You Really Want to Hurt Me and Michael Jackson's Billie Jean. So obviously, if you're going to not reach #1, those are some pretty good songs to lose to. But Hungry Like the Wolf finally helped Rio start making moves on the Billboard charts. So the album jumped into the top 40 in late January. Actually, when it did, at #28, the first week in the top 40 was at #28. It was one spot behind Prince's 1999. And then it kept rising and rising, and it actually reached the top 10 and peaked at #6 for 7 weeks in a row, starting in March. When the dust cleared, Rio spent a total of 129 weeks on the US Billboard album charts. The most amazing thing, though, is that Rio's success retroactively made the band's debut album a success in America. The record was released here and it sold a little bit, but really didn't do very much. So it was reissued with a new cover, and there was a different track listing, including the singles There's Something I Should Know. And that actually became a hit as well. And so that basically ended up charting. And so Duran Duran had 2 records on the charts, the album charts. And then later in 1983, they released the record 7 and the Ragged Tiger. And that was an immediate hit, and that charted. And so by the end of the year, at one point, Duran Duran had 3 studio albums on the Billboard chart simultaneously, had 4 top 20 hits, including 3 that peaked in the top 5. And then the home video they had been planning released and was also a big hit. So basically, Duran Duran was everywhere. And then in 1984, they ended up coming to America for the Sing Blue Silver tour and played a astounding, like, sold out arena tour. But, Rio's impact had such a long tail, partly because the band's US career trajectory, as I just described, was so all over the place. Another example of that. And so while Save a Prayer was a hit in 1982 in the UK, and it actually received MTV airplay in spring 1983, the song actually didn't chart as a single in the US until 1985. It was taken from the mostly live album Arena. And so basically the band completely exploded in the US. So this was Rio. And so the impact of Rio since then has just, basically reverberated throughout, Duran Duran's career. They've been around for over 40 years. Like I said, they were just recently nominated for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. When you see them live, they still largely close their shows with Rio. They will come up, they'll put the album cover up, and everyone will cheer because it's such a beautiful album cover. And they'll play the song, and so basically it's come to represent not just Duran Duran's success, but also the 80s. When you look at the record and the art, you just see it, and it signals something kind of modern and mysterious and cool. You were kind of cool by association if you have Rio. And so, so that's basically the record. Duran Duran, since then, basically, when you look to their impact, they've had an impact on so many basically musical movements since then. It was, if you look at grunge, if you look at new metal, if you look at post-punk, electronic, there are so many Duran Duran fans out there. It's ridiculous. I mean, Stephen Percy, who the ex-lead singer of Rat, actually did a great cover of Girls on Film last year, which you never would expect. But it all started with Rio. Had Rio not become a success, we probably wouldn't be here talking about the band. And we probably wouldn't be here talking about, them 40 years later having this amazing career. And so I was thrilled to finally be able to kind of write this book. And I should add actually that, I'm a little bit younger. I actually wasn't around in the 80s when the record was popular, but I discovered the album via my public library. So that's why I'm so thrilled to be doing this talk tonight, is that when I was a kid, I would go to the library and take out cool albums from the library, like Kraftwerk and Velvet Underground and U2, things that I couldn't afford because, I had a limited allowance. But I got Rio out of the library, and I ended up taking the record out of the library and falling in love with it, sometime right after the Wedding album came out in the early 90s, just because I love this stuff so much. And so, I pretty much owe, I guess you could say that I almost owe my career and owe, being here to the library. And so I'm very grateful for that as well. But I think that's what I got to say, at least for this stuff. And I'm starting to lose my voice. I'm so excited. So
awesome, Annie. It all comes back to the library, right? It all comes back around. I love that so much, and it warms my heart. And I just want to say thank you so much for being here. And one of the great joys of both lifelong listening to music and doing this program has been the opportunity to revisit some of these albums and get to know some inside information about them and really reconnect with it. And I think you helped facilitate that for everybody here tonight. So we're all feeling really good. Thank you. And we've got some great questions. So I'm going to go through some of these questions if we can take a little bit more of your time. So Steph says, woohoo, hi, Annie. What were the top 3 things you learned while researching Rio that you didn't know before?
That's a really good question. So I think I actually did not realize that when they demoed the record, they went back to Bob Lamb, who they had worked with in the late 70s. So I didn't actually realize they had kind of done these demos before going to the big studio in London. So I was not aware of that. One thing I didn't realize, and actually Simon Le Bon said this on Twitter, he did a listening party for Rio, and he actually played some of the musical instruments, like a vibraphone on some of the songs. And basically Colin Thurston got a whole like bucket full of instruments and brought in the studio, and he basically told the band members, go to town. And so Simon basically kind of grabbed some stuff and had some good time. So I did not realize that. I think the other thing, I'm trying to think, I'm still there's something else. So Andy Hamilton, when I talked to him, he mentioned, funnily enough, that the Rio sax solo is actually in kind of a weird key for a song, and so it can be a little bit difficult to play live sometimes. But he's like, I managed to do it, but it was kind of just from a musical theory standpoint, it was a little challenging, which I did not realize. You could never tell.
Awesome. Those are great tidbits. The next question I've got here in the chat is from Beth. Is it still possible that Andy Taylor might reunite with the band, like maybe for the Hall of Fame induction ceremony, or is that relationship permanently broken?
When the band was, got the news that they were nominated, Simon Le Bon was on Sirius Radio, and he was asked about that. And he basically said, I would love to get back on stage with them and Warren Cucurullo, who was actually nominated along with them. And so, at least from Simon's perspective, he's like, that would be great, and Andy Taylor as well. He hasn't said anything outright, but he wrote a really lovely Instagram post talking about what it means to be nominated. And so everyone, at least, immediately has basically been like, this is really special. They all kind of recognize everyone's contributions. So I could see that. I could actually see that happening if they get in. Everyone just has to vote. So, fingers crossed.
Well, I think I saw one of your tweets. Are they leading in the voting right now?
They
online?
are. They're in the fan vote. Them and Eminem are neck and neck.
Okay. Very cool. All right. I've got another question. The Nagel Rio album art is a fave of mine, but for an iconic as it is, I really dislike the visuals on Duran Duran's future album sleeves. Decade is especially repulsive. How is it defaced deliberately, as if they want to take the piss out of themselves? Just curious your thoughts about Duran Duran's album art that followed Rio.
So it's very interesting because there is a little bit of element. It's not Decade, but Midazoland. If you look at the back of Midazoland, there's actually the Rio cover, and it is defaced. Like there's graffiti around it, and it's like they're almost trying to kind of, reinvent their legacy, or kind of say we're not beholden to this. So I think there's something a little interesting about that. I like their album art just because everything is of its time. When you look at something like Big Thing, which is, it screams dance music from the late 80s. Notorious, they were definitely trying to do something different, having this beautiful black and white photo. I like all of their album art, and I appreciate that they're trying to do something different with each album. I think they could have very easily done a Nagel for each subsequent record, and they decided, no, we're going to do something a little different, and so I appreciate that. And I actually like Decade. I'm sorry, Pete. I like Decade.
Yeah, and it helps us connect to the album in another way, I think. Yeah. All right, I'm going to keep going here if you've got the time. So
absolutely, I'm whatever you need.
Awesome. Who do you think the greatest influences are on Duran Duran were?
Oh man, definitely Roxy Music and David Bowie. The band members will talk frequently about how seeing them on Top of the Pops in the early 70s like rearranged their DNA. And John Taylor in his book tells a really lovely story about going to see Roxy Music early on. So definitely them. Kraftwerk for sure. If you listen to especially some of their more dancey oriented things, Nick Rhodes is a Kraftwerk fan. Some late 70s Human League, weirdly enough, too, is a big influence. Japan. They talk, Joy Division. Simon Le Bon loves Joy Division, and you can kind of hear that in his lyrics, and just kind of the way he kind of approaches things, especially on Rio. Trying to think, those are some of the major ones. Definitely kind of the Sex Pistols, all that punk. They were around for that, and it really, I think, inspired them just to kind of say, we can start a band. We don't need anybody to tell us to do what to do. We're just going to do things our own way. So I think those are definitely some influences.
Perfect. Let's see. I know I've got some more here. So this comes from, I think it's from Marcy. Where did you do your research for things like the trade ads? This is coming, a music librarian is asking.
I love this question as a researcher. I love it. So there is actually a website that is out there that has a ton of magazines like Billboard, Radio and Records, this trade FMQB, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. It is worldradiohistory.com. And they have enormous amounts of research. I could not have written this book without that because I wrote it during the pandemic too. So libraries weren't open. And so there's a ton of archival things. Beyond that though was, I owned some stuff. I bought a few things. Some of it, it's amazing what you can find sometimes on Scribd and the Internet Archive as well. And, some of the stuff is of dubious legality. But there's also the free open library as well. Sometimes has some things scanned into. And if you have questions, Marcy, I'm on Twitter, so if it would help you can always message me and I can point you that way.
My own side follow-up would be, it seemed like you alluded to it a couple of times in your presentation. You had a lot of access to interviews, like direct interviews with the band members and managers and all kinds of, so that's cool. Yeah.
Absolutely. The band was extremely supportive, honestly, of the book.
Okay.
I've known a couple of people who work with them for a while. And as soon as I got the book, they were actually kind of my first ask because I said, hey, would you be willing to be interviewed for the book? Because they've talked about Rio a billion times. And so I could have used archival interviews, but I was like, you know what? I want to talk to them and try to get some fresh stuff. And they were so gracious with their time. I talked to Nick, Roger, and John, and then Andy Taylor. And, the insights were just, were so valuable. And then everything else was basically me Facebook messaging people and looking on the internet for websites and emailing people cold and trying to do research like that. So basically kind of a lot of journalism shoe leather, basically.
Awesome.
But yeah, it was great. And the band was so supportive of the book as well, helping me promote it. And so that really meant a lot.
Love it. Yeah. The book is fantastic. And if you don't have a copy of the book, we put a discount code in the chat over there. So you can go to the Bloomsbury website. You can get 35% off the book. So buy Annie's book is what we're trying to say. I've got a couple more questions here. Where did they get the name Duran Duran?
So the movie Barbarella, there is a character called Duran Duran with a D at the end. And so they basically modified it.
Okay. I think there was a question about how cooperative the band was. I think you just answered that. Beth has voted every day since I got nominated for the Rock Hall. Let's see. Am I missing anything? Why was the third time the charm for your 33 and a third? Did you change your pitch or did you wear them down?
Maybe a little bit of both. No, I think I did change my pitch. In the time I last pitched this in 2009. And so this pitch was in late 2018, I believe. And so basically they had kind of changed their proposal structure a little bit. And so I took kind of what I had done in the past and kind of graphed that to that, ripped it up a little bit, wrote things a little better. So that helped because I had a little bit of a better idea how to write a book proposal because I'd actually sold a book in between. And also I think Duran Duran is just a little bit more, at the time I started pitching them, they were starting to get respect. And even in that almost decade since, they've gotten so much more respect. So I think people really, really kind of realized, yeah, this is a band that deserves kind of props for their musicianship. And people are a little bit more willing to recognize that the 80s are important, basically. It's not just some kind of silly decade with neon colors, that there was some really, wonderful, meaningful music there. And so I think that also helped a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes through in your presentation for sure. I was transported myself. Obviously for me, if I can insert myself for a second, it's impossible to separate MTV. I'm a little bit older, so my 14-year-old brain was extremely imprinted by those music videos, Hungry Like the Wolf. So it's hard for me to separate the two, but all that adjunct music as well, that you mentioned, Human League and Missing Persons, and even seeing like the Triumph, the rock stuff, that was that the rock guys liked, just really crazy, wonderful important memories. So I've got to, let me see, they're coming fast and furious here. We've only got a few more minutes, folks, but I do want to get to a couple more questions. Shannon said she would like to know why songs from Rio weren't used in more new wave 80s music. Is it licensing movies, not why weren't they used in movies? Is it licensing issues, you think?
That's a really good question. I don't know. It could be that the band, a lot of bands have control over where their music can be licensed. And so it very much could be that the band was like, yeah, we don't really want to do that. So it could be that, or maybe the songs were too expensive for some movies. I don't know. That's a very good question. I actually, that's a very good observation, because I haven't actually, that's one of those things that when you stop to think about it, you're like, oh, they aren't in movies, like, you think of like, modern English and different things like that. So I don't know. That's a very good question. We'll have to find that out.
All right. So do we have time for two more, Annie?
Oh yeah, I'm all good. I'm whatever.
Okay. Who's your favorite member of Duran Duran?
I know who asked that. I like all members of Duran Duran. I do not have a favorite. I appreciate all of them for their musicianship, for sure. And I think all of them are handsome in a different way. So let me put it that way. Is that diplomatic enough?
So Michael asked, do you know what the inspiration for the chauffeur was?
So yeah, so that was, it's very interesting. So Ian Eames, who directed the video, basically put together this treatment. And so it was a little bit of Helmut Newton. I believe there were some like German movies. He named a couple of them. I know I had them in the book. I have to kind of relook them up. And so, but it was definitely a lot of sort of noir movies and black and white films, and a little bit more, because it's all, when the video basically, and the only reason I didn't play it's a little bit not safe for work. And so basically it's these women and they're driving. And so they're driving through London, and this kind of this brutalist architecture, and they're basically meeting up, and then there's a climactic scene about dancing anyway, but it involves some nudity, but unlike Girls on Film, it's very tastefully done in a sense. And so yeah, so it's very much like kind of meant to be kind of an old-fashioned movie. But Duran Duran like it. Every time they play it live, the chauffeur, they project the video. So obviously, like I said, it captured their aesthetic in a way that I think no one could have predicted at the time.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all the questions we have time for. So thank you so much, Annie. It's been a real treat for me. Thank you for spending your time with us here, and thanks for the library plug. We love that. Everyone, you should go buy Annie's book. Use that Bloomsbury link and use the discount code and get that book. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Annie, for your time tonight, and we'll see you next month for another 33 1/3.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Good night, everyone.